Hello, and welcome to Crisis Watch. Today, we're examining the financial challenges facing Russia as its conflict with Ukraine continues into its fourth year. The economic pressures are mounting, and the decisions being made in Moscow have far-reaching consequences that extend well beyond the battlefield. When Russia launched its military operation in Ukraine back in February 2022, the Kremlin believed it had adequately prepared for the economic fallout. Over several years leading up to the invasion, Moscow had implemented a series of measures designed to insulate the economy from potential Western sanctions. The government reduced its external debt obligations, worked to minimize dependence on Western technology and goods, and built up substantial financial reserves in what became known as the National Wealth Fund. Trade relationships with major partners like India and China were strengthened, with Moscow confident these nations would continue purchasing Russian oil and gas regardless of international pressure. For the first couple of years, this strategy appeared to work reasonably well, with the Russian economy demonstrating more resilience than many Western analysts had predicted. However, as we move through 2025 and look ahead to 2026, the situation has changed dramatically. The accumulated weight of sanctions, combined with the enormous costs of sustaining military operations, has pushed the Russian economy toward a breaking point. What we're witnessing now is a government facing an impossible dilemma where every available option leads to serious economic damage. The draft federal budget, submitted to the State Duma in late September, reveals the scale of Moscow's commitment to continuing military operations. For 2026, the government plans to allocate approximately 12.9 trillion rubles to national defense. When you add expenditures for internal security forces, police operations, and intelligence services, the total reaches 16.84 trillion rubles, which translates to roughly $207 billion. This represents 38% of the entire federal budget. To put this in perspective, nearly 4 out of every 10 rubles the government spends will go directly toward military and security purposes. Russian officials have framed this as a slight reduction from 2025 levels, and technically, that's accurate. Defense spending is decreasing by approximately 4.4% compared to the current year. Back in June, President Putin had promised budget cuts for defense, stating that reductions were planned for the coming 3-year period. However, the decrease is so minimal that it barely registers as a meaningful change. More importantly, Russia's actual military spending has consistently exceeded official figures. Additional funds are regularly allocated throughout the year, often concealed within other budget categories, or provided through supplementary appropriations that don't receive the same level of public scrutiny. To generate the revenue needed for this massive military expenditure, the Finance Ministry has proposed increasing the value-added tax from 20% to 22%, effective January 1, 2026. This tax applies to most goods and services purchased throughout the country. While essential items like food, medicine, and children's products will maintain a reduced rate of 10%, the vast majority of purchases will become more expensive. Combined with other tax increases and the elimination of certain pandemic-era brakes on insurance contributions, the government expects to raise an additional trillion rubles annually, equivalent to about $12 billion. Essentially, ordinary Russian citizens and businesses will shoulder the financial burden of continuing the war. The economic impacts of these decisions are already becoming apparent. Throughout 2025, inflation has remained persistently high, driven primarily by the government's massive spending on military production and personnel. The central bank responded by raising interest rates to historic levels, reaching 21% in October, before bringing them down slightly to 18% by mid-year. While these high rates help control inflation, they also make borrowing extremely expensive for both individuals and businesses. Mortgages become unaffordable, business loans are out of reach, and consumer spending drops. This creates a vicious cycle where the economy slows down even as prices continue rising. The labor shortage has become another critical factor undermining economic stability. Hundreds of thousands of workers have been mobilized or recruited for military service since 2022, removing them from the civilian workforce. Additionally, an estimated 1 million Russians have left the country since the war began, many of them young, educated professionals who saw limited futures at home. These departures have created severe staffing problems across virtually every economic sector. Construction sites lack workers, agricultural operations struggle to find laborers, transportation and logistics companies cannot fill positions, and manufacturing facilities operate below capacity. Every month, tens of thousands more men are recruited and sent to the front lines, further draining the available workforce. Many of these individuals will never return, creating permanent gaps in the labor market that become harder to fill over time. Even Russia's most important economic sector, the oil and gas industry, is showing signs of strain. For decades, energy exports have provided roughly 1/5 of all federal budget revenue, serving as the stable foundation supporting government operations. Production levels have declined in recent months, partly due to labor shortages and aging infrastructure, but also because of Ukrainian strikes targeting refineries, pipelines, and storage facilities. These attacks have damaged critical infrastructure and forced temporary shutdowns at multiple locations. As this continues, Russia's ability to produce and export oil at previous levels becomes increasingly questionable. Western sanctions, while not immediately devastating when first imposed, have accumulated significant effects over time. Multiple waves of restrictions have been implemented since 2022, each one targeting different sectors, individuals, or financial institutions. Russian banks have been largely cut off from international payment systems, making cross-border transactions difficult and expensive. Businesses struggle to import necessary components and equipment, forcing them to seek alternative suppliers at higher prices or lower quality. Export markets have shrunk as European countries reduced their purchases of Russian energy and other goods. The European Union continues developing additional sanction packages, exploring new ways to restrict Russian access to Western technology, financial markets, and industrial goods. In June 2025, at the St. Petersburg International Economics Forum, several prominent Russian financial figures publicly expressed concern about the economic trajectory. German Gref, who heads Sberbank, Russia's largest bank, warned that economic growth was approaching zero and that authorities needed to act quickly to prevent the slowdown from becoming stagnation. He emphasized that restarting a stagnating economy would be far more difficult than managing a controlled slowdown. Maxim Reshetnikov, the Minister for Economic Development, went further, stating that the country was teetering on the brink of recession and needed policy changes to avoid crossing that threshold. Other banking and finance officials echoed these warnings, suggesting that Moscow faced a fundamental choice between protecting the economy and continuing military operations at current levels. The government's decision, as reflected in the 2026 budget, makes clear which option was chosen. Rather than scaling back military spending to ease economic pressure, the Kremlin opted to maintain high defense expenditures and accept the economic consequences. This choice sends a clear message to Ukraine and Western nations that Russia has no intention of backing down or seeking a negotiated settlement in the near future. From Moscow's perspective, publishing such an ambitious war budget demonstrates resolve and commitment, potentially discouraging opponents from believing Russia will run out of resources or willingness to fight. However, this strategy carries enormous risks. Economists have compared the current situation to the housing bubble that triggered the global financial crisis in 2008. Just as the American real estate market absorbed excessive investment until it could no longer sustain itself and collapsed, Russia's military-industrial complex is consuming resources at an unsustainable rate. Vast sums of money flow into defense factories, weapons production, military salaries, and benefits for soldiers and their families. This creates artificial economic activity that appears healthy in the short term, but lacks long-term viability. Eventually, this bubble will need to contract, And when it does, the consequences will ripple throughout the entire economy. The problem, as several economists have noted, is that Russia has backed itself into what they describe as a catch-22 situation. The military-industrial complex has become so dominant that the broader economy now depends on it. Millions of jobs are directly or indirectly tied to defense production and military operations. Entire regions have oriented their economies around supplying the armed forces. If the government were to suddenly cut military spending in an attempt to rebalance the economy, massive unemployment would result, businesses would fail, and the recession that officials are trying to avoid would arrive anyway, possibly even more severely. But continuing on the current path guarantees that the military bubble will keep growing until it eventually bursts on its own, with equally catastrophic results. Economic forecasts for 2025 have already been revised downward multiple times. Early in the year, officials predicted growth of 2.5%, but by August, that projection had been slashed to 1.5%. By the third quarter, actual growth came in at just 0.6%, well below even the reduced expectations. Some analysts now predict the economy could contract by 0.7% in the fourth quarter, which would mark the first year-on-year decline since early 2023. Manufacturing and industrial production figures are similarly disappointing, running well below earlier projections. Services sector growth has also slowed considerably, reflecting reduced consumer spending as households face higher prices and limited income growth. The increase in value-added tax scheduled for January will likely accelerate these negative trends. When consumers pay 22% tax instead of 20% on most purchases, they inevitably buy less. Businesses see reduced sales, which leads to lower production, fewer hours for workers, or even layoffs. This puts additional downward pressure on an economy already struggling with high interest rates and labor shortages. The government hopes the additional revenue will help cover the budget deficit, which has grown as military spending increases while some revenue streams decline. However, the tax increase may ultimately prove counterproductive if it slows economic activity to the point where overall tax revenue decreases despite the higher rates. Public sentiment has also shifted noticeably. While official polling in Russia must be interpreted cautiously given restrictions on free expression, available data suggests that popular support for continuing military operations has declined. More Russians now express preference for a negotiated settlement rather than prolonged fighting. As everyday life becomes more difficult, with higher prices, limited job opportunities, and economic uncertainty, patience with the war's costs appears to be wearing thin. The government has tried to maintain public support by emphasizing patriotism and framing the conflict as essential for national security and future generations. However, when families struggle to afford basic goods and see no improvement in their circumstances, these appeals become less persuasive. The international dimension adds another layer of complexity. Russia had hoped that maintaining strong relationships with China and India would provide an economic buffer against Western sanctions. While both countries have continued purchasing Russian oil, often at discounted prices, these relationships haven't fully compensated for lost European markets. China, in particular, has been cautious about appearing to violate sanctions or providing too much overt support that might jeopardize its own economic relationships with Western nations. Trade has continued, but not at levels that would fundamentally change Russia's economic trajectory. Looking ahead to 2027 and 2028, the budget projections show continued high military spending, though with some modest reductions planned. This suggests the Kremlin expects military operations to continue for at least several more years, possibly settling into a protracted conflict rather than achieving a decisive outcome in the near term. Each year of continued fighting, however, deepens the economic problems and makes eventual recovery more difficult. Infrastructure continues aging without adequate investment. The workforce continues shrinking. Technological gaps with other nations widen, and the accumulated costs mount higher. Some economists have suggested that the only realistic path to avoiding complete economic collapse would involve negotiating an end to the conflict in a way that allows sanctions to be lifted. With renewed access to international markets, Western technology, and normal banking relationships, Russia could begin addressing its economic imbalances more effectively. The military-industrial complex could be gradually downsized rather than experiencing a sudden collapse. Workers could transition back to civilian sectors, and government spending could be reoriented toward productivity-enhancing investments rather than weapons production. However, achieving such a settlement would require compromises that Moscow has shown no willingness to make. Russian officials have rejected repeated opportunities for serious negotiations, maintaining maximalist positions that Ukraine and its supporters cannot accept. As 2025 draws to a close and 2026 approaches, Russia finds itself in an increasingly precarious economic position. The budget decisions being made prioritize short-term military objectives over long-term economic health, betting that the country can sustain its current trajectory long enough to achieve its goals in Ukraine. Whether that gamble succeeds or leads to economic catastrophe remains uncertain, but the warning signs are clear and growing more serious with each passing month. The government has effectively chosen a path that accepts near-certain economic pain rather than seeking alternatives that might preserve stability but require changing course in Ukraine. What happens next depends on variables that remain difficult to predict. How long can the current spending levels continue before forcing a dramatic policy shift? Will international pressure increase or decrease? Can the military-industrial bubble deflate gradually, or will it burst suddenly? How will ordinary Russians react as their economic circumstances continue deteriorating? These questions will shape not only Russia's economic future, but also the broader trajectory of the conflict and regional stability. For now, the Kremlin has made its choice, and the Russian people will live with the consequences of that decision for years to come. That's all for today's episode. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next update, covering the latest developments from this ongoing situation.